Well, to help understand what's happening in Sri Lanka, we're joined from the capital, Colombo, by former government advisor Rajiva Wijesinha. And in Oxford, England, we have Shamara Wettimuny, an associate at Verite Research. I thank you both for joining us on the Newsmakers. Shamara, let me begin with you. With everything that's happened over the past few weeks in Sri Lanka, is Sri Lankan democracy under threat?
That's a good question. Thank you. I think the manner in which former President Mahindra Rajapaksa came into power with the SLPP on the 26th of October was deeply problematic. And his refusal to accept the verdict of not one but two no-confidence motions passed against him suggests that democratic norms aren't being adhered to at the moment. So yes, at this moment, it does appear that democracy is under threat.
So we're hearing, Rajiva, from Shamara, that democratic norms are under threat in Sri Lanka. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think the whole polity is certainly under threat, but it depends on how you define democracy. There is a school of thought that says that the Mahindra Rajapaksa has had a vote of no confidence passed against him. That's not quite correct, because there are procedures for votes of no confidence and they were not followed. And what was termed the standing orders were suspended, which is really quite improper. But I do believe very strongly that obviously when the president appoints the prime minister, there should be a check on the parliamentary vote. And it really is a pity that when Parliament reconvened on the 14th, the motion was not tabled so that it could have been taken up 5 days later, as is specified. Instead, there was all this talk of having things like voice votes. And you can't really have a voice vote on a matter of no confidence. The larger question really is, how do we resolve the ambiguities in our constitution? Sri Lanka is an elected presidential system, which I believe have in Turkey as well. And there are certain powers to the president, which of course can be exercised only in the context of the checks and balances of the legislature. But the president is the executive head. And unfortunately, when this president was elected, while we all agreed that the president's powers should be modified and reduced, there was an effort by the former Prime Minister Rajiva Wijesinha and his advisors to smuggle in that the president should only act on the advice of the Prime Minister, and that was not acceptable. So there are certain ambiguities, and the best way of resolving them is through appealing to the Supreme Court. And I was rather sad that the former Prime Minister and his advisors did not go to the Supreme Court to check on the constitutionality or otherwise of his dismissal and his replacement by somebody in whom the president thinks.
Okay, so let me ask Shamara. Shamara, should they have gone to the Supreme Court? Was that the next logical step?
It appears that the UNF or the UNP did decide to do this through a vote in Parliament. Now, I would defer to what Professor Wijesinha has said about, procedures and standing orders, as I'm sure he knows far more about it than I do. But I wonder whether we could maybe look at the context, the political context in which they decided to take this vote by voice, and also to do this through Parliament. So I wonder if you have seen the footage in which they tried. So first of all, on the issue of suspending standing orders, it comes in the context where Parliament had initially been prorogued and then dissolved in order to prevent a vote of no confidence from taking place. And that is why, that to me is an assault on Parliament. And so in that sense, the suspending standing orders and then going in for a vote of no confidence is understandable. And on the issue of the vote by voice, again, I believe, yes, maybe they should have done it through electronic vote or vote by, proper vote. However, if you have seen the footage from Parliament last week, it was absolute thuggery on display. Right. It was honestly very, very shameful. There was chili powder being thrown. There was someone occupying the speaker's seat. There were attempts to prevent the speaker from entering. Yeah. And when he enters Parliament with the protection of policemen, there was chili powder, books being thrown at him, pieces of his chair being torn apart and thrown at him. So it was in that context that he had to resort to taking a vote by voice.
Right.
and I'm afraid it was to do with the context at the time.
Yeah, and we're looking at those pictures, you know, people throwing punches, not just chili powder. It was a big chaotic mess, right?
It's most disgraceful.
Right. So, Rajiva, let me ask you,
Yes.
as we go back to the fundamentals at the very beginning of this crisis, was President Sirisena wrong to sack Mr. Wickremesinghe, the Prime Minister? Or was he right to sack the Prime Minister, but was he maybe wrong to appoint the former leader, Mr. Rajapaksa, in his position as Prime Minister? Or was he right for both actions, or what do you think?
Well, the first question is it constitutional to dismiss a Prime Minister? I believe it is, but there is ambiguity in the Constitution. I was actually looking through my notes, and way back in 2015, I actually proposed several amendments, and I kept saying, why don't we have consistency? But that was ignored. There was a great rush and lots of ambiguity. But I think there is ambiguity. I think the president was right to take a decision in what he thought was the interests of the country. And I think he believed that Mahindra Rajapaksa was the best Prime Minister under the circumstances. I personally think that whether Mahindra Rajapaksa is going to be a good Prime Minister or not remains to be seen. But I certainly believe he'll be a better Prime Minister than Ranil Wickremesinghe. And I suspect this was the president's thinking. And perhaps the president should have acted earlier when in February earlier this year, the Prime Minister's party, and indeed his own, got a really pitiful amount of votes compared to Mahindra Rajapaksa. So I think it's fairly clear where the confidence of the country lies. But there is the constitutional provision that once the Prime Minister is appointed, he should be able to show that he has the confidence of the House. And as I said, it's been a farrago of really horrible behavior by both sides. There was the chili powder being thrown, but the day before that, the opposition members had brought in knives into Parliament. And, it was only two of them. Yesterday, I was telling some of the very decent people in the opposition, how could they countenance this? And of course, both sides will claim that the other is worse than they are. But the simple fact is both sets of parliamentarians, a few on either side, I should say, have behaved appallingly. That is why I think the best thing is to have recourse to the courts. The UNP has gone to the courts with regard to the resolution of Parliament. And I think we should actually await a legal approach to the clear ambiguities in the Constitution.
Shamara, Mr. Rajapaksa is hardly the most unifying figure in the country. Tell me what his appointment has meant for all issues, whether it's reconciliation, especially in parts affected by the civil war with the Tamil Tigers, whether it's issues of Sri Lankan identity. Is he going to be a divisive figure?
Thank you. As Professor Wijesinha said, in February 2018, his party did comparatively much better than the other two parties. He won something like 40% of the vote at the local government elections in February, suggesting that he does have a significant amount of support behind him. But on issues of reconciliation, minority rights, there is a huge, huge question mark. And unfortunately, what we saw, I think it was yesterday, a protest and then a meeting granted to representatives of the Bodubala Sena by President Maithripala Sirisena, possibly to discuss the release of Nyanasara Thera, someone who was imprisoned on the charge of contempt of court. However, he is someone who has been closely associated with incitement to violence against Muslims and other minorities. Now, this itself is indicative that any progress, which admittedly was very incremental under this Yahapalaniya government, may actually be reversed under a Mahindra Rajapaksa government once again.
So, Rajiva, those who see this as a sign of a more sort of aggressive, non-inclusive Sinhala nationalism that comes with all sorts of things that might make life more difficult for minorities in Sri Lanka, is that a warranted fear?
Well, I think certainly given the way the Mahindra Rajapaksa government behaved in its last couple of years, there are reasons for worry. As you probably know, well, you may not know this, but I was in a few parliamentarians on Mahindra Rajapaksa's side who supported Sirisena on the grounds that Rajapaksa was not being inclusive enough, was not moving on the reforms he promised. But I have to say that there was great disappointment with the way the Sirisena-Wickremesinghe government behaved. But on my last conversation with Mahindra Rajapaksa before I left was I told him how appallingly Reverend Nyanasara had behaved. And I asked him why he wasn't tougher about that. And of course, he had two answers, one of which I has to grant was not entirely accurate, was not entirely wrong. He said, the Americans are paying this man to make me unpopular. And of course, I knew that the Norwegians had in fact given Janasara a lot of money. I don't think they intended him to behave as badly he did with the money, but they never checked as to what he was doing with it. And of course, Mahindra Rajapaksa, he has a sharp tongue. When I told him you really should be much tougher with him, his answer, well, people like you will claim that I'm violating their human rights. But I fully agree with Shamara that people like Janasara need to be tightly controlled and not allowed to do this type of thing. I would like to hope that Mahindra Rajapaksa has, learned his lesson. And of course, the fact is that Sirisena himself does have a reputation for pluralism. The failure to move on reconciliation, of course, by this government, which had no reason not to, has been, to my mind, shocking. And I think the lack of attention to the development of the areas in which the minorities stay is very disappointing. And, one thing that has to be remembered is that one of the reasons for the February result was, as Bill Clinton said, it's the economy stupid and people getting poorer and poorer. Before the change happened, the rupee plummeted from 150 to 175. And of course, that's partly due to the strengthening dollar. But we did nothing to correct that. And, the government was, talking in mixed tones. Some people said, no, it's very good for exports. And others said, no, we've got to stop it. And I think we have to understand that while the issues of, pluralism are very important, I think it's also important to make sure that the country continues with the development and the growth rates that we saw in Rajapaksa's last 2 years.
Right. And at the heart of all of that is a disagreement about how to actually do that. So, Shamara, there's an idea that the one camp is looking east and west, or north, east and west, and the other camp, the camp that's in power right now, only wants to look east and only wants to do business with the Chinese. Is that the way it's playing out?
Former Mahindra Rajapaksa government certainly did do a lot of business with the East, but we actually have seen the Ranil Wickremesinghe government as well enter, into agreements with China as well as other parts of the world. I think the issue at stake at the moment is that prolonging this particular crisis is only going to lead to further financial instability. Now, the rupee has been doing pretty badly over the year, but actually I had a look at the trajectory of the rupee in the last couple of weeks, and it depreciated significantly again. There was a drop on November 10th, the day after the president announced his decision to dissolve parliament. And just today, actually, we've received news that Moody's has downgraded Sri Lanka's financial status to B2. Now, this means higher interest rates for our debt repayments. We have one big repayment coming up in January. And so, this crisis is actually going to cause us a lot more financial problems than previously envisaged. And that is the premise on which Mahindra Rajapaksa came in on, claiming that he could solve this financial crisis or instability that we have been seeing under the previous government. But that does not appear to be panning out at the moment.
Right. So, Rajiva, why should Sri Lankans trust the man who signed a deal with the Chinese over a port that left Sri Lanka billions of dollars in debt?
I think you've got it all wrong. The Mahindra Rajapaksa government wanted to develop the Hambantota port and offered it to India first. And India was not able to take it up. I discussed this later with the Indian High Commissioner. He said, perhaps we made a mistake about that. And then he approached China and got a loan on reasonably good terms. And the sovereignty remained with us. But, I think the Americans and also the Indians got a bit worried because the Chinese sent in submarines. The Americans think that only they can send submarines in anywhere and no one else should. Sri Lanka didn't say only the Chinese can send in submarines. They actually have allowed all these guys to do that. But the real problem came in that after the last election, this particular government, in particular Wickremesinghe and his then foreign minister, insulted the Chinese. I suppose they thought the West would come and bail them out. They thought they could behave like Israel and do anything they liked and the West would love them. But as you know, the West had little money, so they had to turn to the Chinese. And it was then that the Chinese, I think, basically screwed them. Well, the Chinese had dealt reasonably well with Rajapaksa in terms of interest rate. The Chinese got a 99-year lease on the Hambantota port, which is outrageous. And Rajapaksa was the first to protest about this. And the Indians were very upset, but their solution was to ask Wikramasinghe to give them a part of the Colombo port. And when I spoke on Indian television last week, they said, well, isn't it very unfair that China should have one port and we shouldn't have another? I mean, that is nonsense. The Wickremesinghe government was, I think, wrong to give a 99-year lease to China. But of course, they plunged the country into massive economic crisis because there was a bond scam where interest rates were 10%, and Ranil's Wickremesinghe central bank governor gave bonds worth 10 billion to the only bidder, who happened to be his son-in-law. And a great deal of money was then given to the United National Party members. So I think with that, we had a very, very serious crisis of confidence in our central bank. And that meant that, they turned to China and gave in to demands that they shouldn't have given in to.
Right. And I appreciate you giving us the timeline as it evolved over the years. Let's talk politics again as we wrap up, Shamara. There's a way of looking at this to think that, well, if they can't hold things together in Parliament and they're scuffling in Parliament, how are they going to instill and inspire confidence for Sri Lankans to hold it together on the streets? Right? So there's a constitutional crisis, there's political instability. Can they keep things together until elections in 2020, or does something drastic need to happen in the next year and a half so that things don't spiral out of control?
I imagine what you're also asking me about is the possibility of early elections. Now, on that issue, I think if we want to talk about elections, you need to think about it in terms of incentives for the three main blocks or players in this scenario. So the president, I mean, does he have incentive to call early elections? I think it's less about that, but more in terms of what political space or what the situation will be for him in a post-election context. For Mahindra Rajapaksa and the SLPP, early elections is certainly something that they want and they are calling for at the moment. And this would be to capitalize on their electoral success or gains in the February election. But I would say that, and then lastly, the UNP, I don't know whether they would have wanted elections a few months ago. However, given the events of the last couple of weeks, we've actually seen a surge in support for the UNF, the UNP, and so they may actually be incentivized to go for elections now, which I don't think they would have been a couple of months ago, more than a month ago. But I think the other question on the issue of elections is who would control state resources at the time of an election, and that is more likely to determine the timing of elections.
Yeah, fluid time, uncertain time politically in the country. Rajiva Wijesinha and Shamara Wettimuny, looking forward to having you back on the Newsmakers soon. Thanks so much for joining us.